Welcome to the first episode of Logic Made Lucid, an introduction to logic by Dr. Jacob Waldenmeyer. In this first episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what logic is, what logic does, and then we're going to examine a couple of core principles that are very important for understanding how logic works. First of all, a bit of background. Oftentimes we hear people say things like, well, that makes sense, right? We say these things ourselves. That seems reasonable. Or we hear people say, oh, that sounds rational. But the challenge with using these phrases is that oftentimes when we say that things make sense, when we say that things seem rational or reasonable, oftentimes we say this as a result of influence by feelings or guesses or prejudices or hunches, instincts, or biases. These lead us to say, oh, that makes sense, but without actually considering why it is they make sense, why it is they seem reasonable. We make errors very regularly in our thinking, and it's very valuable to study logic because that helps us to avoid errors, helps us to make fewer errors, and it helps us to think more clearly and to speak more clearly. Logic in general provides a more consistent, reliable, and objective means of determining whether or how much an argument is truly rational or whether it truly makes sense. So a definition of logic, and there are lots of other ways of understanding it, but by and large we can think of logic as a group of methods that enable us to derive new information from given information or to assess the consistency and plausibility of claims. Logic generally allows us to do these things, among other things, but these are the basic two effects of using logic. So some examples of deriving new information. We could say, for example, here's a statement. We're going to be starting by examining clusters or groups of statements. Right? So we can derive new information from these two statements. We can say, actions that improve health are good. And then 2, exercise is an action that improves health. Right? We could take these two statements, and then from them, we can conclude that therefore exercise is good. Right? So you see how we took two statements, two factual statements in general, and then we can use them to then generate another statement from them, right? That is then true. We're getting new information from given information, right? That new information is that exercise is good. I'm going to take another example. We could say habits are either beneficial or harmful, right? If that's the case, then we could also add smoking is a habit that is not beneficial, right? Now, of course, I know that there are lots of different ways of understanding this, but if we accept these two ideas as true, if we accept these two statements as given information, then from them, we can derive some new information, which is the conclusion, therefore, smoking is harmful. And I hope you see how this third, this item comes from the first two premises. Habits are either beneficial or harmful. Well, smoking is a habit that is not beneficial. Well, then, smoking must be a habit that is harmful. Okay? So this is an example. These are a couple of examples of deriving new information from given information using logic. Some examples of assessing consistency, we might say look for this kind of statement. It is never okay to kill a human being. Right? This is one of the things that we oftentimes will hear and when we're speaking morally. But then we may also have a statement, killing in self-defense is okay. Right? A lot of the time we generally would accept both of these statements. Right? Okay, well, there is a challenge here. There's something inconsistent about these two statements. In one case, we're saying it's never okay to kill a human being, but then we're saying killing in self-defense is okay, right? So you see how these contradict each other, right? We can't say it's never okay to kill a human being, and then also say that killing in defense is okay, self-defense is okay. Now we could modify these statements. We could add some qualifiers. We could say, for example, we can merge them by saying it is never okay to kill a human being except in self-defense, right? And then we're adding some more consistency by recognizing that exception or that contingency. All right, here's another example, and this one's a little bit more complicated. Let's say we can take the statement, migrants should have the same rights as citizens, right? So migrants meaning people who came from another country. Some people will say illegal aliens, or now, of course, not all migrants are illegal aliens, of course, but we might say whatever we want to say by migrants, right? People who are immigrants should have the same rights as citizens. One may say that. Now, there are some people who won't, but there are some people who will. So let's say we take this statement. Now remember, these are examples of assessing consistency in statements, right? So first we've got migrants should have the same rights as citizens. Then we've got felons should have the same rights as migrants. Some people may argue this, right? Now, not so sure. There's lots of discussion that can be had about these statements, but we're taking statements and we're going to examine their consistency between them. So far, these first two statements, migrants should have the same rights as citizens, and felons should have the same rights as migrants, those are consistent. Now, we may disagree with them, but they're consistent with each other. In other words, it's possible for somebody to accept both of these statements without contradicting themselves, right? Without being inconsistent, right? As much as we may agree or disagree, right? Okay, now let's add a third statement to this. Let's say somebody might accept the idea that felons should not have the same rights as citizens. Okay. Now, a lot of the time, many people would accept this, right? If somebody's a felon, perhaps there will be some of their rights that will be taken away because they've committed certain really extreme crimes and so forth, right? But notice, let's look at all three of these statements together, right? The first statement, saying migrants should have the same rights as citizens, you might be able to spot the inconsistency already, right? But in the first, just to examine these, what's going on here? Migrants should have the same rights as citizens. Now, we can express this concisely using this kind of symbolism, right? Now, here we're saying the rights of migrants equals the rights of citizens, right? You can see the symbolism. Now, later on in this series, we're going to talk about how phrases and words can be represented by these kinds of symbols. It's not very different from using a variable in math, or you may have, and again, we'll go into more detail about this later, but you may have, if you've ever learned about poetry or rhyming schemes, right? A lot of the time we'll represent certain rhymes with letters, right? So this is really pretty much doing the same thing. The rights of migrants equal the rights of citizens, or should equal the same, should equal the rights of citizens. Okay, so that statement. Now let's look at the second statement. Felons should have the same rights as migrants. So we're talking about felons and migrants here. And we're saying the same thing, should have the same rights as migrants. So we can represent that as R sub F equals R sub M. Okay? All right, now let's take a look at the third statement. We're talking about felons again, and now we're comparing the rights of felons to the rights of citizens. We might say that felons should not have the same rights as citizens in this third statement. Okay? And we could represent that as by saying R sub F does not equal R sub C. Okay, again, this is looking a little bit mathematical. Now, there are important differences, I should say at this point. There are important differences between logic and mathematics. There's some overlap in certain ways and some key concepts. But remember, in logic, we're talking about words. We're talking about concepts and ideas. In math, we're just about always talking about numbers, right? In certain ways. And it's valuable to recognize the difference, right? But also some similarities. And again, more on that later. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. We have these three statements, and we've kind of depicted them in a very concise fashion using symbols, right? Well, one of the things we could do, we can kind of look at what we have here, these two statements. Now notice, if we take these two, we can actually derive new information from that. Remember earlier in this video, we were talking about how logic can be used to derive new information. Well, if we accept these first two statements, if we accept that migrants should have the same rights as citizens and that felons should have the same rights as migrants, well, what that means is that the rights of felons equals the rights of citizens, right? So again, if you're not sure, focus just on the first two sentences. Migrants should have the same rights as citizens. Felons should have the same rights as migrants. Well, if felons should have the same rights as migrants, and migrants should have the same rights as citizens, well then felons should have the same rights as citizens. Now you might recognize something similar to this if you were learning about mathematics. This is sometimes called the transitive property of equality, right? Now again, it's different in logic than it is for math, but for the sake of drawing an analogy or drawing a tight comparison between the two, we can effectively make the same kind of argument, right? So we see here, so if R sub m equals R sub c and R sub f equals R sub m, well, therefore, now you'll notice this little horseshoe, this little horizontal horseshoe that I put in there. We're going to learn more about this symbol later. But this is basically saying this implies, right? So the stuff that I've boxed in blue, taken together, those imply the stuff that I've boxed in green, right? R sub f equals R sub c. All right, now notice, let's look at that final statement now, that third statement. We had said that R sub f does not equal R sub c, because we had said felons should not have the same rights as citizens, right? So here, there is definitely a contradiction. These three statements taken together are inconsistent because they contain a contradiction, right? So this is another way that logic can be used to assess the consistency of statements when we look at them carefully and we examine them for what they are actually saying and what can be inferred from them. So thinking about the core principles of logic, one of them is non-equivocation, right? So non-equivocation basically means that a group of statements is logically coherent only if their expression's meanings are constant. So equivocation itself is when you are using a word, but then you change the meaning of a word, or you use it in a different sense later on in your argument, or later on in your discussion, or a set of statements, right? When you change the meaning of a word, it's a kind of sleight of hand that we oftentimes use verbally. And sometimes we do this accidentally, sometimes we do this intentionally, but equivocation is changing the meaning of a word in the middle of an argument, or the middle of a description, or any kind of speech. Now, this non-contradiction is another important core principle of logic that we've kind of already touched on. We've looked at a contradiction when we were examining consistency, right? Basically, non-contradiction insists that a group of statements is logically coherent only if they are altogether free of contradictions, right? So these could be understood as two fundamental principles for logic. Something could only be logical, something could only be coherent if these two conditions are satisfied. There's no equivocation and there's no contradiction. So let's look at some examples of this, of a violation of these core principles, right? So we'll look at a couple of examples, or well, one large example that includes contradictions and equivocations, all in kind of one nice, neat, bad argument. Here we are. So let's say, for example, we take a common thing that some people may say. They might say, life is precious. Right? Now, we may also say that whatever is precious should not be destroyed, right? Because it's precious, right? It's very valuable, right? And again, we're going to examine this a little bit more soon. I'm just going to lay out a few statements that we oftentimes might accept. Okay, life is precious. Whatever is precious should not be destroyed. All right, let's take another statement that we may all accept. Humans should do whatever is necessary to live, right? Again, there are some counterexamples. There might be some cases where this is not true, but let's just generally take a look at this statement. Humans should do what is necessary to live. Okay, well, something else that we might recognize, again with some important qualifiers, is that destroying life is necessary for humans to live. If we, even for, say, vegetarians, well, isn't it the case that in order to live, we need to eat vegetables, vegetation, which contain the nutrients that we need to survive, right? Well, when you eat a carrot, that's the result of having destroyed the life of a plant. All right, so if we trace it back, destroying life is necessary for humans to live. Ultimately, there is some kind of life that is going to be destroyed in order for us to live, right? And again, we're going to talk about exceptions to this, and we're going to examine this argument here. But you'll notice, if we take statement 3 and statement 4 together, humans should do what is necessary to live, destroying life is necessary for humans to live, well, what pops out of that? Take these two statements together, and then we then get a third statement. Humans should destroy life. I want you to pay attention to this. Notice, if we accept statement 3, humans should do what is necessary to live, and if we accept statement 4, destroying life is necessary for humans to live, then humans should destroy life, right? Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, I don't really like where this is going, right? This seems really odd. Something's wrong with this argument. And you are right. You're correct. Something is wrong with this argument, right? And so now let's examine further this argument so we can see why sort of you have this instinct, right? That the argument's wrong. Now you might have spotted already some contradictions. All right, so let's look at an example of a contradiction, and then we're going to look at why an equivocation led to this contradiction, right? Look at these first two statements. Life is precious, and whatever is precious should not be destroyed. Well, here comes the contradiction that you might have expected. From these first two statements, we have the conclusion. We can then get the new information that life should not be destroyed, right? Life is precious. If life is precious and whatever is precious should not be destroyed, then life should not be destroyed, right? Well, and this comes from the first two statements. Well, and then if we progress down to the bottom, where we also concluded that humans should destroy life, there's our contradiction. We've said life should not be destroyed, and we've said that humans should destroy life. Right? So this is a contradiction, and we can see here that that this means that this general argument, this set of statements, is incoherent. Right? There's a contradiction in it. Right? Okay, now let's explore a little bit more the origin of this contradiction and what's really the part of the problem here. One of the problems is equivocation. We have used the word life. Really what we have meant is different things when we refer to life. Right? In the first three statements, really what we're talking about very likely is conscious life or sentient life. Life that is self-aware, maybe. Life that can experience pleasure versus pain. Maybe life that is kind of autonomous and that is capable of higher thinking, right? Perhaps that is self-aware. Maybe I've ever said that. So that's what we're talking about here when we mean life. Life is precious, especially if we're talking about human life. Right? We might say that human life is precious, and whatever is precious should not be destroyed. Okay, so that's one sense of life. Now we've changed what we mean by life in the final three statements. Humans should do what is necessary to live. Well, destroying life is necessary for humans to live, so humans should destroy life. Well, here we're really talking about a life that is less than what I hate that expression, but life that is not as valuable, say, as human life. We might say vegetation is part of that. We might say, oh, I don't know, fish, right, or certain kinds, other kinds of animal phyla. Might be less valuable than human life or less sentient. Certainly, say carrots or celery might be less sentient. And so that is the kind of life that we might be talking about destroying here, right? So that's the life that humans should destroy in order to live, is vegetation. And of course, it's sloppy the way that this has all been put, because when it says that humans should destroy life, well, certainly not willy-nilly, right? We should destroy life only when it is necessary to survive, right? Okay, so this is an example of a kind of sloppily put argument, right? And there's some forms of equivocation in here. There's a lot of imprecision in this argument. Now, something else that we could also look at when we want to correct this argument, you can always modify arguments. When you find a bad argument, it's helpful to adjust it and correct it, right? You can always do that. And then you actually become a little bit better of a thinker for doing that, right? So a couple of other ways that we could correct this, besides adding the qualification that we're talking about, you know, sentient life or conscious life or human life, or maybe we could even say primates life or mammals if we want to extend it or broaden it to other kinds of things. Again, with lots of qualifications, we may look or study these statements, right? Could we really say that whatever is precious should not be destroyed? Is that really the case, right? We may notice some equivocation with the word precious, right? What exactly do we mean by precious here? There are different ways that we might use the word precious, right? And no matter what we plug in for the word precious, is it the case that whatever is precious should not be destroyed? Are there some things that are precious that eventually should be destroyed, right? We can think of lots of examples, perhaps, of precious things that maybe should, under certain conditions, be destroyed, right? So we may want to modify this second statement, right? We want to add some qualifiers, right? Make it a little bit more, a little bit closer to what we could accept as true, right? Or as a rule or as a principle. How about this other statement? This statement number 4. Destroying life is necessary for humans to live. Is that the case? Or are there some exceptions to this? Is it, are we able to live without destroying life? There are some cultures and subcultures and even some large religions where they try to dedicate themselves to not destroying life, right? If we think, for example, about fruits, right? Fruits are, well, the part of them that is really alive is, and it's not technically alive, is the seed. And the seed will come into life if it's planted. But fruits are sometimes designed to be eaten, right? So that their seeds could then pass through and then grow, and actually it helps the life if a fruit is eaten and then excreted in soil where it can then grow, right? So is it the case that destroying life is necessary for humans to live? Well, there might be some exceptions to that. It's possible to get nutrition. Oh, here's another example: dairy or eggs, right? These come from life, but it's not required that life is destroyed in order to get these. And yet we could use them for nutrition. All right. So I hope this has been a helpful overview of seeking contradictions or seeking equivocations and using them to determine whether an argument is coherent or whether an argument is logical, whether an argument truly is rational. Right? We have gone over in this video, we've gone over what logic is. It's a method for assessing a group of arguments for coherence. And we have been able to use logic in order to extract new information from given information and to check for consistency. In the next section, we will talk about types of logic. I hope you'll join us then. Thanks for watching.